In the early months of 2008, a platoon was assigned to patrol a stretch of Waziristan, where the mountains folded over each other like clenched hands. Their orders were simple: verify the existence of a suspected supply route that intelligence believed linked two unmarked valleys. The mission brief was standard: 3 days out, 1 day to report and return before the next weather front. Nothing in the paperwork hinted at danger beyond the usual. They moved at dawn, 12 men and 1 translator, engines low as the road thinned to gravel. The further they climbed, the quieter their radios became. What began as the usual hum of static soon felt like resistance, each transmission arriving slower, more distorted, as if dragged through thick air. At first, they adjusted frequencies, recalibrated antennas, and logged the anomalies as interference. But by the second day, the distortion had turned to silence. The last message received was a short fragment: Grid 27, moving, interference, and then only white noise. Command traced the signal to a limestone ridge surrounded by mist. It wasn't on any of their tactical maps, only on an older Soviet survey where the terrain was labeled unstable. Locals had another name for it: Kof Dara, the Valley of Fear. No one at headquarters questioned the translation. It was entered into the report as a regional term, nothing more. By evening, the sun dropped behind the ridge and the team's tracking beacons froze in place, flickering like distant heartbeats. Command believed they'd stopped to rest. In the logbook, an officer underlined the time: 1847. That would be the last confirmed mark of their movement. After that, the valley returned to silence, complete, dense, and perfectly still, as though it had swallowed the echo of every word ever spoken inside it. At first light, Command resumed contact attempts with the platoon. Every channel returned the same sound, an even, steady hiss. No bursts of coded replies, no digital pings from their beacons. It was as though their signals were being absorbed before they could reach the air. The duty officer checked the timestamps, adjusted the relay, and waited. The mountains stayed quiet. Aerial reconnaissance was dispatched within hours, 2 passes over the grid line where the transmission had last been recorded. The first drone sent back low-resolution footage: scattered rocks, dry stream beds, no tire tracks. The second circled for 40 minutes, mapping heat signatures. Nothing. Even the engines of the aircraft produced faint interference, as if the sky itself resisted being scanned. Inside the operations tent, speculation began in soft tones. One officer suggested an ambush, though there were no signs of movement in the valley. Another proposed equipment failure, yet all gear had passed inspection. A few, quietly, wondered about defection, though that word lingered in the air, like something impolite. By the second day, no trace of the platoon had surfaced. Their families hadn't been notified. Officially, it was still a communication blackout, not a disappearance. The mountain weather could do this, they told themselves. Storms, magnetic shifts, faulty relays. It had happened before, and eventually someone always walked out. But the maps showed no storm that week. The skies were clear, the temperature stable, and still nothing. Late that night, the intelligence clerk assigned to the case noticed a strange detail. The platoon's last ping wasn't logged by the main relay tower. It had come through an older, unused channel, one that hadn't been active in years. He stared at the timestamp, double-checked the route, then wrote a single line in the margin of his report: Signal received from within. When the search order was finally signed, Command requested local cooperation. A translator from the nearest town was sent ahead to speak with the elders, men who remembered the land before the borders hardened and the maps were redrawn. They met under an old mulberry tree at the edge of the village, its roots spreading through cracked stone like veins. The interpreter recorded their words carefully, though much of what was said never made it into the final report. The elders spoke of valleys that breathed, caves that exhaled warmth by day and drew in the night like lungs. They warned that sound travelled differently there. It didn't echo, it folded. Some claimed herders had followed their goats into the ridges and never returned. Others said the place chose who could pass through. When asked for a name, they used a phrase that roughly meant, the mouth of the earth. One story stood out. An older man, his eyes pale and clouded, told of British soldiers who vanished there during the colonial campaigns. Same wind, he said. Same silence. He drew a circle in the dust with his finger. slowly closing it until nothing remained in the center. The translator hesitated before repeating his words to the officers. Back at camp, the conversation was logged as local superstition. But when the officer in charge reviewed the transcript, he noticed something strange. Each time the translator mentioned the valley, the recorder captured a faint hum in the background, steady, low, like a pulse buried in the air. Before handing in his report, he took a red pen and circled the coordinates twice. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was habit or caution, but those circles would later be the last marks made beside the platoon's name before their file went cold. 2 Black Hawks crossed into the valley just after dawn, their shadows gliding over slopes the color of ash. Below them, a narrow convoy traced the same path the missing platoon had taken, slow, deliberate, and silent, except for the crunch of gravel beneath tires. The air felt thick, motionless, as though the land had forgotten how to echo sound. Inside the cockpit, the pilot remarked that the altimeter kept flickering between readings, even though the sky was clear. From above, the valley looked calm, an expanse of pale dust, a dry stream cutting through it like an old scar. No fires, no wreckage, not even footprints. When the team disembarked, their boots left perfect impressions in the soil, yet after a few minutes, the marks softened and vanished as if the ground had exhaled. They called it a trick of light or heat distortion. Still, several men found themselves glancing back, checking whether their own tracks remained. They established a perimeter, marked the grid lines, and began scanning. The valley absorbed every sound, the hum of engines, the voices on the radio, even the metallic ring of tools striking stone. Every attempt to contact command met with a dull crackle. Once, a transmission did return, but only as an echo of their own words repeated half a second later, like someone listening and mimicking from a distance. The temperature began to drop without warning. The medic noted a 10-degree fall in less than 5 minutes. The dust rose in light spirals moving against the wind. The interpreter whispered that the mountains were breathing again. The commanding officer said nothing. By dusk, they had found no trace of the missing platoon, no shell casings, no gear, no signs of struggle. Yet everyone agreed the valley did not feel empty. It felt occupied by its own kind of waiting. That night, the search team established camp beside a dry stream bed that wound through the center of the valley. The ground was firm but strangely warm, as if holding on to the memory of daylight long after the sun had gone. Lanterns were lit in a loose circle, their glow falling short against the open dark. Beyond that faint perimeter, the valley was a single, silent shape. Around midnight, someone noticed a vibration in the soil. Soft, rhythmic, almost musical. At first it was dismissed as the low hum of the generator, but when the machine was switched off, the sound remained. It wasn't a noise exactly, more like a frequency you could feel beneath the ribs. The engineer ran a handheld sensor over the ground. The needle quivered without direction, detecting nothing and everything at once. He marked the reading as subsonic resonance, though the cause was left blank. In the distance, a faint shimmer appeared along the ridge. Not light, more the suggestion of movement within darkness, like heat-bending air. One of the local scouts refused to stay any longer. He said the valley hummed when it was thinking. The translator tried to persuade him otherwise, but the man packed his bag before dawn, whispering a prayer as he left. Inside the camp, sleep came in fragments. Some men described hearing the wind change direction mid-breath. Others said the ground pulsed softly beneath their mats. When morning broke, the hum had stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt artificial. In the logbook, the commander wrote only one line: no contact, terrain active. The words meant little to anyone outside the valley, but those who read them there understood. The ground might have stopped moving, but it was listening now. At dawn, the valley was washed in a pale, colourless light. Mist lingered close to the ground, moving in thin strands like smoke. The team began their sweep from the southern ridge, advancing in slow intervals. A metal detector chirped once faintly before falling silent again. When the men brushed away the topsoil, they uncovered a fragment of a rifle strap, frayed and dusted with salt. A few meters away lay a dented helmet, half buried in the sand, its surface pitted as if it had been submerged in water rather than earth. There were no tracks nearby, no sign that anyone had disturbed the ground for weeks. The entrance to the cave revealed itself almost by accident. One of the engineers noticed a patch of brush that seemed too symmetrical, too even in color. When he pulled at it, the soil gave way, revealing an opening just wide enough for a man to crawl through. The air that spilled out was colder than the morning breeze, dry and metallic, carrying the faint scent of stone dust and something older. Instruments taken near the entrance recorded a sharp temperature drop, nearly 15 degrees within a few steps. They sent in a small drone equipped with a camera. The feed flickered, static blooming across the screen like frost. For 3 seconds, the camera caught a glimpse of smooth, curved walls and what appeared to be fabric, white, thin, moving slightly as though caught in a draft. Then the signal collapsed. When they retrieved the drone, its lens was fogged from the inside. No one spoke for a long moment. The commander ordered a pause, calling for reinforcements before any further entry. The men stood around the dark opening, watching it breathe cold into the daylight. It didn't look like a cave. It looked like an invitation. The entrance yawned wide beneath a fractured ridge, its shadow stretching like a wound across the valley floor. From a distance it seemed natural, just another cut in the stone, but up close the symmetry felt wrong. The mouth of the cave sloped inward at an angle too smooth for erosion, as if shaped by intention rather than time. The first team approached with helmets lit and tethers clipped to steel stakes. When they crossed the threshold, the air grew heavy, compressing against their chests like the slow weight of deep water. Inside, their footsteps shifted from crunch to echo. The cave's interior walls reflected sound oddly, bending it until each word came back blurred and delayed. They switched to hand signals to avoid confusion. The light from their headlamps struck the walls. Pale, almost polished, veins of mineral glinting faintly under dust. Some sections were smooth as glass, others rippled as though melted by heat. Instruments showed no radiation, no heat signatures, only pressure anomalies. The air grew denser the deeper they went. At 70 meters, the radio link began to falter. Static rose like a tide, swallowing speech. The commander's voice cut through once. "Keep line tension, move slow," and then vanished. Those outside could still see the guide rope trembling in their hands, each movement faint but deliberate. The line was the only connection between worlds, inside and out, light and dark, known and uncharted. 5 minutes passed before one of the tethered men signaled to stop. The beam from his light had found something, a cluster of marks etched into the stone, circular and shallow, too uniform to be natural. They seemed to spiral inward, disappearing into the dark. No one spoke. The cave gave nothing back. Even breath felt borrowed there, hanging too long before fading. The descent began slowly, every movement deliberate. The air inside the cave felt layered, denser with each step, pressing close enough to dull sound and thought alike. Their lights cut through the dark in narrow cones, touching walls that looked neither wet nor dry, surfaces too smooth to be stone, reflecting faint, distorted colors like oil on water. One of the geologists noted that the formation didn't match any known strata of the region. "It's like the mountain was poured," he said quietly, voice flattening against the silence. The passage forked into 2 corridors, each curving downward at unnatural angles. Compass readings spun erratically, unable to decide which direction was north. Metallic veins ran through the walls, shimmering dull silver under their lights. When one of the soldiers brushed his glove against the surface, his radio cracked sharply, emitting a burst of static that carried the faint echo of their own footsteps. Replayed half a second too late. The technician listened closely and realized the sound wasn't bouncing back from the walls. It was repeating, as if recorded and played again from within the air itself. The smell was faint but distinct, not rot or earth, but something electrical, sterile, like the inside of old machinery. The medic described it later as the scent of a storm that never arrives. Temperature sensors fluctuated wildly, suggesting pockets of heat without visible source. Every now and then, one of them thought they heard voices just beyond range, whispering in patterns too measured to be imagination. When they paused to listen, the sound would fade, replaced by the low hum they'd felt the night before. By the time they reached the first chamber, their lights had dimmed to half strength. The walls here curved upward into a perfect dome, smooth and seamless. The floor was covered in fine dust, undisturbed, yet their footprints refused to hold. Each mark softened, then disappeared. They left a portable recorder near the mouth of the cave before the second team went deeper. It was an old device, durable, analog, the kind used for documenting seismic activity. Its red light blinked steadily in the dust while the men descended, then slowed, as though the batteries themselves felt the weight of that place. When they returned hours later, the recorder was still running, but the counter showed an impossible number: 127 minutes. Its tape capacity was half that. Back at camp, the technician played the audio. It began with the normal sounds of movement: footsteps, clipped voices, metal scraping rock. Then came static, not white noise but layered, textured, pulsing like breath. Beneath it, faint and distant, were tones almost too low to hear. When slowed down, those tones formed something close to vowels, elongated, uncertain, like speech forced through water. For several seconds, a laugh could be heard, thin and human, but no one in the team recalled laughing. They replayed the tape 3 times. Each time the sound changed slightly, as if the recorder itself were remembering differently. The technician replaced the batteries, rewound the tape, and let it run again overnight. In the morning, the recording had grown longer. The same voices returned, slower now, followed by silence so dense it made the speaker crackle. When the generator powered down, the recorder clicked once and stopped. The reel jammed mid-rotation. The file was labeled, tagged, and sent for analysis. It was never logged into the official archive. When the technician tried to retrieve it days later, the folder name existed, but its contents had vanished. Only the timestamp remained. That night, someone noted the sound again, soft, rhythmic, coming from beneath the ground, in perfect sync with the recorder's final minute. Months later, fragments of the case began to surface through internal channels, emails, scanned memos, pieces of conversation never meant to leave the department. Most were routine, but some stood out. They referenced loopback events, temporal signal bleed, and audio displacement phenomena. The language was cautious, bureaucratic, and oddly precise, as though describing a machine rather than an event. The attached files were partial, 1 page of 10, and/or a paragraph cut mid-sentence, but they all carried the same classification mark: restricted acoustic study, Hofdara sector. One transcript recorded a discussion between 2 analysts reviewing the recovered audio. The first claimed the patterns were environmental, wind harmonics caused by irregular geometry. The second disagreed. He pointed out that the tones repeated at mathematically regular intervals, mirroring human speech rhythm. "It's not natural resonance," he wrote. "It's response." That line was underlined twice. Another message described the missing platoon's digital trail. GPS pings had been recovered from a secure cache, but the timestamps repeated across several days, identical down to the second. The same coordinates appeared again and again, as if the system had sent the data in a loop. One analyst called it a ghost packet, a signal that couldn't decide if it was old or new. The memo concluded that environmental interference was the likely cause, though the phrase "likely cause" was typed in smaller font, as if added later. Then came the final document, a short summary drafted for senior command. It noted no hostile engagement, no environmental hazard, and no material loss beyond personnel and equipment. The last line read, "Investigation closed pending terrain stabilization." Below it, a signature had been blacked out completely, the ink smeared slightly by a fingerprint. No one knew who wrote it, or whether that line meant the land itself, or the truth had simply been buried. In the months that followed the official closure, stories began to drift out from the valleys surrounding Hofdara. They came through shepherds first, men who spent their nights under open sky and swore that, after midnight, the air would come alive with voices. Faint at first, scattered phrases carried on the wind. The words were in English. They weren't prayers or cries, just fragments of radio chatter, coordinates, numbers, short commands. The kind of words soldiers say when no one's supposed to be listening. A teacher from a nearby village tried to record the sound one night using his phone. The file played normally until he lifted the device from the ground. Then it went silent. When he placed it back against the dirt, the voices returned, so clear he could distinguish tone and rank. He brought the clip to the district office, but it was confiscated under national security protocol. He never saw his phone again. Other witnesses described seeing flickers of light in the valley during sandstorms, like distant flares that didn't move with the wind. One shepherd said the voices always began after the light appeared, as though one called for the other. Each time someone tried to follow the sound, it shifted direction, leading them deeper into the hills. None claimed to have reached the source. When journalists from the regional paper tried to verify the reports, they found the area sealed under new military restrictions. Checkpoints had appeared where none existed before. No one was permitted to enter after dusk. The teacher, when asked years later, said he no longer cared whether the story was believed. "Those voices weren't ghosts," he said softly. "They were men still calling home. The ground just hasn't let go of them yet." Weeks after the last reports faded from public attention, an internal memo surfaced briefly on a secure network, unsigned and without header. It was written in the precise, unhurried tone of someone who had seen too much and decided to sound neutral about it. The author referred to themselves only as Field Analyst, Acoustic Division. The note was short, a single paragraph that began, "If the valley reflects more than sound, containment is not possible. The platoon may still exist within its own frequency." The line puzzled the few who read it. Some thought it metaphorical, a poetic observation about echoes trapped in complex rock formations. Others took it literally, suggesting that the valley had formed a kind of natural chamber, capable of looping certain frequencies indefinitely. When one senior officer requested further clarification, the file path already led nowhere. The memo had vanished from the database overnight, leaving only its registry number in the index. Even that number appeared twice, duplicated, slightly altered, as though the system had copied itself in confusion. Rumors spread quietly through the research branch. Some claimed the analyst had resigned. Others said he'd been reassigned to a naval acoustic lab under a different name. One technician remembered him speaking once about sound as memory. "If you record something long enough," he said, "it begins to remember you back." Years later, a printed copy of the memo was discovered in a declassified archive box, mislabeled weather data. The text had faded to grey, but one sentence was still legible, underlined in pencil. "Echoes are not repetitions, they are returns." No author's mark followed, only a small stain at the bottom corner, a ring from what looked like a coffee cup, and the faint impression of a fingerprint, pressed deep enough to leave its own silence on the page. The official report arrived 3 months later, stamped and sealed with the quiet authority of finality. It named no enemies, cited no gunfire, no insurgent interference, no environmental collapse. The cause of loss was listed simply as terrain failure. To the families, it sounded sterile but conclusive. An accident in unstable ground. Personal effects would follow, they were told, though none ever did. Internally, the tone was colder. A short directive advised all future operations to avoid the Kof Dara grid line indefinitely. Aerial surveys were suspended. Satellite imaging requests were denied without explanation. When questioned, logistics claimed data corruption in the sector, though the same satellites continued to map areas just kilometers away without issue. The command center's war map was quietly replaced. The ridge where the platoon disappeared was no longer marked. One officer, whose cousin had been among the missing, noticed that even archived radio logs were being deleted. Each day, another file vanished from the shared database until the folder itself disappeared. He asked the communications chief if this was protocol. The man answered carefully, "We were told to clean interference." Months later, during an unrelated training exercise, a new recruit scrolling through an old system log stumbled across the platoon's designation number attached to an inactive frequency. The signal showed no content, only an endless carrier wave, steady, unbroken, repeating every 20 seconds. It was impossible, yet there it was, still transmitting. He brought it to his superior. By morning, the log was gone again. Officially, the case remained closed. 12 soldiers lost to the mountain. Unofficially, their names were whispered by those who still served near the border, often spoken not as memory, but as if listening for reply. Some said the static over the field radios carried a faint rhythm, an old call sign trying to come home. Years after the last file was buried and forgotten, a retired geologist returned to Waziristan under a civilian permit. He had once assisted with terrain mapping for the army, though his name never appeared on the official roster. Age had slowed him, but curiosity remained. A quiet need to understand what the others had chosen to erase. He arrived in early spring, when the valley was pale and windless, the silence carrying the faint metallic scent of dust. From the first step into Kof Dara, he sensed change. The valley floor had shifted. Ridges that once pointed east now leaned south, and the stream bed, where the search team had camped, had filled with fine magnetic sand. He marked coordinates and compared them with his old survey notes. The terrain had displaced itself by nearly 20 meters, without quake or landslide to explain it. Even the rock strata seemed misaligned, layers inverted as though folded from beneath. He collected samples from a shallow cut in the hillside, grey fragments threaded with metallic veins. In the lab, those veins emitted faint electromagnetic readings, a pattern repeating every few seconds, identical to the data logged from the platoon's last transmission. He ran the tests again, thinking it error, but the pulse remained, steady, rhythmic, like a small heart still beating somewhere inside the stone. In his final field entry, he wrote, "It is as if their signal has soaked into the land. Every layer remembers something. Every rock hums a different name. When the report was submitted, no agency claimed responsibility for reviewing it. The samples were archived without classification and later misplaced. Only his field notes survived, tucked between maps in a private collection. The last line underlined twice in pencil read, 'Nothing disappears. It only changes what it becomes part of.' The last remaining audio file from the Kof Dara operation begins with static, faint, steady, almost peaceful. Beneath it, fragments of human sound emerge. Boots over gravel, clipped breathing, a rustle of fabric against stone. Then a voice, distorted but clear enough to carry intent, moving toward the sound. After that, nothing for several minutes, only the slow build of interference that rises and falls like a tide. Analysts once argued that it was wind striking the cave walls. Others insisted it was speech, slowed far beyond recognition, vowels stretched until they became tone. When the file ends, there is a pause, and then a single burst of noise, short, sharp, metallic. Some say it's the recorder shutting down, others that it's an unfinished word. Either way, the silence that follows feels deliberate, as though the valley itself had exhaled. Years later, during a regional sandstorm, a monitoring station near the Afghan border detected a faint signal on an unused military frequency. The pattern matched the Kof Dara transmission exactly. Identical bursts, identical gaps. It lasted 6 minutes before fading into static. 2 weeks later, it happened again, always during storms, always from the same direction. Engineers traced it to atmospheric reflection, but the coordinates lined up perfectly with the vanished platoon's last position. The military made no statement. The frequency was locked, its access restricted to higher clearance. But among radio operators who still scan the old bands at night, a story persists. They say that if you listen long enough, between the wind and the static, you can still catch fragments, a breath, a name, the quiet rhythm of boots echoing in the dark. Some transmissions, the story goes, don't end. They just stop being heard.